It's performance review season. I promise I'm never going to sing on this channel or otherwise again. But it is performance review season. In this video, we'll talk about two aspects of performance reviews: giving feedback and receiving it. Because even if you're a manager, you're probably getting reviewed by your own boss. So we'll talk about things to keep in mind. First, giving feedback. The first thing to keep in mind is understanding any limitations. That can mean things like forced rankings. Does your organization have a rule that says if you have 10 people on your team, you can give 5 3s, so many 4s, and so many 5s? Hey, I'm not a math major. But those type of things are really important to know before you go into performance reviews. Other things are compensation. A lot of times right now, organizations are doing layoffs, so the likelihood of being able to give big bumps or bumps that your employees may want and you think they may deserve may be limited right now. So getting a sense of that before you go into performance reviews so you can think through your messaging and anything that you're going to need to talk about. Another limitation can be the form of the review. Does your organization have specific documentation or styles of giving reviews? Again, it's important to understand these things before you start writing them. And if you need training, ideally your HR can help. Now we'll talk about the critical aspects of delivering those reviews. The first rule of performance reviews is no surprises. And I'll repeat that, no surprises. One of the worst things that can happen is for an employee to go into a review and be completely caught flat-footed, meaning that the feedback that they receive, that they hear, and that can affect their compensation, their potential for promotion, to be totally inconsistent with what they've been hearing through the year. This often happens if you haven't been giving enough feedback ongoing throughout the year or the 6-month period, whatever the review covers. But it is important that things be consistent. And so if you haven't been giving feedback to employees, before the review is an important time to start giving that feedback and having it, to try to plant that flag before you have review season. Because when employees hear those messages and they're inconsistent with what they've heard, it's not going to reflect well on you, and that employee is likely going to be looking out the door. Now, some things may be a surprise, like a ranking, and that can occur especially if you have a forced ranking system. Again, that means if your organization gives a specific number that things have to align to. Why do organizations have that? Often it's financially driven. Organizations may budget for certain merit increases, meaning increases to salary or bonuses or equity, things that they may give. And so organizations may say, this is what we've planned as an organization, so now we need employees to fit into that. I don't care for forced ranking systems because I think if an organization or a team has really strong performers, if you tell a strong performer, yeah, you did great this year, but you're getting a meets expectation, and that means less compensation, then that employee that you think has been delivering and exceeding expectations is going to be looking out the door. So that's why I don't like those systems. But if things like that are going to be a surprise, the messaging is important. Because if you, as their manager, who often is delivering that message, if you tell an employee, oh, this is out of my hands, I'm sorry, well, that employee, 1, has just lost some respect for you, but 2, is likely going to be going over your head to think, okay, so who do I need to be talking to? So keep that in mind if something like a ranking is going to be a surprise, because that frequently is more common than the feedback. Again, ideally the feedback is consistent, and if it's not, do what you can before review season to have conversations so it's not a surprise. But if that ranking is going to be a surprise, especially if it's driven by your organization, then explaining why this is good and trying to own that messaging is often better than just saying, sorry, it's out of my hands. Another rule of giving a performance review is to be clear, especially if you're going to give critical feedback. If you try to water it down, that just makes mud. But it's also important if you give positive feedback to talk about exactly what that employee did and the impact on the organization so they know what to repeat moving forward. As an employment lawyer, I've often looked at performance reviews, sometimes when they get to litigation. But in HR, I've also looked at them where an employee thinks, I haven't been told anything negative about my performance. And when I look at reviews, sometimes I look at the language and I think, that's really fluffy. And what that means is it's clearly trying to be soft so as not to hurt that employee's feelings. And I get it. It doesn't feel good. Again, that's why that many times an employee's performance review feedback is inconsistent with what they've heard throughout the year, because it doesn't feel good to tell an employee what they did wrong. But it is really important. And so if an employee is not meeting expectations, you're not doing yourself any favors because you're expected to manage your team. You're not doing your organization any favors because that employee is not going to meet organization goals if they don't know what they did wrong. And you're not helping that employee because whether they stay at your organization or they go elsewhere, they're likely going to have to understand what they do to improve over time. So being clear is incredibly important. And again, talking specifically. If you have critical feedback, I tell people to be clear about that in a form. And again, that employee should not be hearing that for the first time in that review. But to have specific examples rather than generalities. That's another one of the areas that I've seen in HR and legal that often is deficient in performance reviews, because I look at it and think, I have no idea what happened and I don't understand. It's filled with corporate speak or generalities, like your performance is inconsistent. If that's true, then give examples. Inconsistent meaning you have a target to deliver this report every Tuesday by 12 o'clock. Frequently you haven't provided it unless we've asked, and it's been days after the fact. We need it because this report flows into XYZ, and as a result, it slows down things for the organization. Again, that can be a longer way of saying it. But being specific and clear is incredibly important, and so the employee walks away with an understanding of what to do next. Another rule in giving a performance review is to be caring. And what I mean by that is people will say, I don't want to be mean, it doesn't feel good. Of course it doesn't. It doesn't feel great to sit across a table or a Zoom call or whatever and tell someone that they didn't do well. But there are ways to do that can be caring. First is, before you get into that conversation, thinking to yourself, what's the point of this? This is to help this individual as a professional. Again, whether they stay at your organization, whether they move to a different role in your organization, whether they improve and succeed in that role, or even as they go on throughout their career. Giving that feedback is important. All of us can think of different times when we haven't done something well. And if you've done something and didn't get feedback at the time and had to learn about it long after the fact and think to yourself, I wish someone had just told me, then you can be the person that just tells that person. So thinking about that in your mind before you have the conversation. My point in this is to help this employee. Again, whether they stay here or not. But also is framing to that employee. There's things that you can say to help out. So as you start a conversation, if it's not a good review, telling the employee, you might be disappointed in this, and I am as well, but I want to talk about the ways that we expected you to perform over the last year or whatever period, some of the deficiencies we saw, and what we'd expect moving forward. And then we'll talk about a plan, and that's what we'll talk about next in the video. But by saying that to an employee can be better than just passing over the paper and saying, so sign here at the bottom. But explaining to the employee, look, I want to help you improve, but that isn't going to happen if I'm not clear about some of the areas that we expected we'd see progress and what happened otherwise. Another part of being caring is listening to the employee. A performance review conversation should be a two-way street, so the employee should be able to ask questions, and you can tell the employee, do you have questions? I want to make sure that the clarity isn't just me telling you things, but you asking any questions so you can understand where things went wrong and what to do moving forward. And also, the employee may raise things that you need to think about. Right now, a lot of organizations are short-staffed, so an employee may be expected to do the job of 3 people when they're only 1. And so taking the opportunity and talking to that employee and asking questions and letting them ask questions. And some of your answers may be, that's a good question, let me think about that. Other things may be, I understand you've had to take on more. Let's talk about your workload and ways that we can work on that to ensure that you're successful and able to meet the things that are most important to the organization moving forward. So having that conversation can be another way to be caring if you're giving that bad review. Finally, a rule in giving performance review feedback is giving that path forward, meaning what's expected. All right, in our next one-on-one, let's talk about some of these areas and build a path forward, and keeping up with those in the one-on-one so that this isn't just a once-a-year conversation, but painting that picture to say, a year from now, or the next review cycle, I'd expect you to XYZ. Let's talk about a path to get there. And there's some ways you as a manager can give those opportunities. If someone needs to be more confident talking to others, giving them opportunities and then saying, we'll have a practice session beforehand. Please work to schedule around my calendar. So you're putting some of that on the employee so that they need to take initiative. But things like that and having that plan by telling the employee what you'd expect in the next time period, giving them concrete steps to do that, and giving them opportunities to work on those with your support can be much better ways as a manager to deliver feedback, especially if it's critical. And if it's positive and you have an employee with a good review, also painting that path forward to say, you've had a great year and we're so happy to compensate you. Now, sometimes in a pie eating contest, the reward is more pie. and telling the employee, these are the paths I'd like to see for your development in areas where you might teach others. Let's talk about ways we can do that and what's going on your plate to make sure we're not just adding to it and not being really focused about ways to help you teach others in the organization some of the best practices that helped you over the past year, or to free up your time so that you're able to really drive value in areas that matter. And I've used some corporate speak here. I don't really like corporate speak, but some of those ways talking to employees, depending on the language of your organization, can be helpful. Again, painting that picture, whether someone performed well over the last year or poorly. As you paint that path forward, make sure that you keep up on that. I say, a performance review isn't a newspaper, not something you toss on the driveway and move on with life, but ensuring that in the one-on-ones you have topics and agenda items, again, ideally in a shared Google document or other type of shared document, that track really specifically to those goals that you've set out for that employee over the next year, whether their performance was good or bad, and making clear that you're giving them that feedback ongoing moving forward, especially if you haven't done it as much as you could have over the last year. Those are tips on giving feedback. Stay tuned for next week for part 2, where we'll talk about receiving feedback, because even as a manager, you're likely getting a review from your own boss.